Hi, folks. You might remember that I said I was going to stick some extra content in if I could get permission. Friend of the pod, Bruce Carlson, who's the host of the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast, has graciously agreed to allow me to provide you guys with some episodes of his show that I think have particular bearing on matters at this point in time. You're only going to get one that I can say for certain. There's others I may do if I have time. It's a long story. I got a lot of shit on my plate and very little time to get it taken care of. Um, so, and Patreon supporters, in theory, this will be a free one. With the way they've changed everything, I don't know, but I will not mark it as to charge you for it. But it is important for the following reasons. Not only does it describe events somewhat similar to what happened this past weekend with the Trump Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, and that's what it fucking was. You will often hear that the political realignment, because prior to the Civil War, well, prior to around the time of the Civil War, let me phrase it like this. The Democrats were the party of slavery, and the Republicans were the party opposed to slavery. And people will often say, oh, well, the parties basically flipped positions in the 1930s when FDR became president. Others have will pin it at 1948 when Harry Truman, after the lynching of an African American in, I think, Texas, who had served in the U.S. military during World War II, and Truman, who was racist as fuck, let's be honest here, was angered because he's like, they murdered a veteran. These fucking assholes murdered a veteran. That's fucking bullshit. So I'm going to desegregate the army or the military, and maybe that'll solve the problem. Obviously it didn't, but it was an improvement. So, but as you'll hear in this episode, that realignment actually began earlier than that, because it's talking about the 1924 presidential conventions that both parties had. And the Democratic Party made a public statement, more or less. I mean, the party, it's been a while since I've listened to the episode, so I don't remember the exact details. But the Democratic Party was the party that was condemning the Klan, while the Republican Party was only vaguely alluding to the Klan being bad. And this was in 1924, a decade earlier than most people would have would place the line beginning. But this really is where it began, if not a few years before. And I apologize, I forget the name of the guest Bruce has on there, and they talk about it. And you just need to hear not only what happened at both the conventions, but how the media covered both the conventions, because they are in stark contrast to how shit's being covered today. So I want you all to listen to it. If I have time before the election, I will put out more episodes of the stuff that Bruce has done I can think of that apply here. But I may not have time before the election. I will try to at least get a Hex and Hammer episode out on Sunday. Again, all depends upon circumstances and things are a little too complicated for me to go into in detail right now. But you'll definitely be hearing from me after the election, regardless of what the results are. I put in to take the night of the election off because I realized I work second shift, and I'm not going to be worth much at work because I'll be nervously waiting the results and following that along. Another thing I want to say is that I am largely abandoning social media platforms. I'm going to stick primarily to Blue Sky, and that's about it. I log into Facebook to check and see who's having a birthday and we skim to see if anybody's having a real crisis. But I'm basically done with them. I'm done with Twitter. I'm done with all of them. Here's why. That article I told you about in that the Washington Post, where you punch in your zip code and it lets you find out that, how the money is going to the various candidates. Facebook is censoring that link when I drop it into political Facebook groups where the members would be interested in seeing that. What I've discovered is I post the link. Facebook makes me think initially that it's posted it to the group. And when I come back a day or so later, because I'm curious what reactions might be to it, there's no responses, and I see that I have a pending post. What? Yeah, it's a pending post. Apparently, it's sucked it up and made me think, oh well, the admins have to approve it. Bullshit. The admins, it's there because I know some of the admins, and I know they would approve it. And in the description box for this, I will also, in addition, a link to Bruce Carlson's site. I will drop a link to a story in Wired. And I'll just read the headline for you. And that should tell you everything you need to know. Facebook is auto-generating militia pages as extremists auto-generating militia group pages as extremists continue organize in plain sight. Okay? That sounds really bad. Here's the subhead. Ahead of the election, anti-government militias are using Facebook to recruit, coordinate, train, and promote ballot box stakeouts. Meta isn't shutting their groups down and is even auto-generating pages. Yeah. So I'm killing. I'm just not gonna use Facebook very much. So if you need to contact me for whatever reason, there's the email address, trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. I am on Blue Sky as Tucker Drake. I am on Signal as Tucker48.40. If you're planning on leaving the country should Trump get reelected, I suggest you use the Signal app to communicate with me. Not Facebook, not Blue Sky. Signal is one of the more secure apps out there. It's not the most secure app, but it is, it's, for complicated reasons, it's as secure as we can possibly be right now. And let me just double check. Oops. Sorry, I'm just checking something. There we are. I know, this is great podcasting, isn't it? Yes. Okay. I was just making sure I gave out the right ID. It is Tucker 48.40. Everybody's got a dot and something with Signal. I don't know why. And it's 48, the numbers, not the word spelled out. Okay, so I'm going to get out of here because I got to take care of some shit. And here's Bruce and his guests, and I will be talking to you again soon.
You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The Sephora Savings Event is coming. Are you ready to get
this and that? I don't gotta choose.
You're right. You don't. Shop all your favorite makeup, skincare, hair care, and fragrances for less. Find brands like Rare Beauty, Glow Recipe, Valentino, K18, and everything else you want on sale starting November 1st. The Sephora Savings Event is almost here. Shop the sale at Sephora and Sephora at Kohl's. Limitations apply. Must be a beauty insider. See terms at Sephora.com for complete details.
I am so glad to have John Blackwell on. He is on Twitter at 100 Years Ago News. And what he does is he looks at the news from 100 years ago. We last interviewed John when he was looking at 1921 because it was 2021. Now it's 2024, as you know. And so he's looking at 1924. And John is just not going to stop. And he's joining me on the program today. John, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on. Love this show. Love to be on it.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to you. And I know your Twitter, once again, 100 Years Ago News, is just a wealth of info. It gets very esoteric, which is cool. And you get into little interesting stories, and just like people might find when they listen to my cast, but it will be about the year that we're, looking at, the time period of 100 years ago. So we're going to talk a little 1924. There's a lot going on. I mean, the biggest thing, though, is it's an election year. You got a national scandal with the Teapot Dome. We're going to get into that. Unfortunate hold that the Ku Klux Klan has over America, not just like hidden in the woods somewhere, but really in suburbia and other places. So all of these things are things to talk about when we look at 1924, good, bad, and ugly. I don't even know where to begin. Maybe we should begin with that Teapot Dome.
Yeah, that's a good place to start because it kind of explodes into the headlines right in January. So you can start the year with it. And it is amazing to see it like take off right away as like this catchphrase. Like in the 70s, it's Watergate. In the 20s, it's Teapot Dome. Not everybody knows what it means. Like how many people remember Watergate's the name of a hotel? How many people know what Teapot Dome means? It's even hard crazy, to discern.
Right? They probably think it's on a table or something. Right.
It was the name of a rock formation in Wyoming. And I guess it got the name because it's kind of dome-shaped and kind of teapot shaped. The photos I see of it doesn't really look like that, but it probably wore away over the years.
It's not very impressive.
And it was part of what was called the Naval Oil Reserve, which was very important at the time. This being right after World War I, our fleet is moving on this new thing, oil instead of steam power. And the government is moving to safeguard the oil that we need for our ships, for our defense, which is like suddenly now we see as very important in the world. The Navy Department, of course, would run the fleet. It owned the oil reserve, even like as far interior as Wyoming. The whole scandal basically traces to the fact that Albert Fall, who was Warren Harding's Interior Secretary, really saw it as a chance to make a lot of money, or at least enough money to buy his dreamed ranch in New Mexico. And what he did was accept basically as many bribes as he could stuff in a bag to hand over the rights to drill on these oil reserves to, the businessmen who were contributors to the Republican Party. He couldn't just hand it over. He had to get the Navy to sign over the control of these reserves, which he did. It helped that the president, Warren Harding, probably didn't know much about what was going on and was very weak and easily influenced by his friends. Albert Fall ran the whole operation. It was actually pretty much out in the open that this had happened because it was in the headlines in 1922 that the Interior Department was now allowing this drilling to take place, and very controversial in the Western states, where these people, these kind of unlike now, these wealthy businessmen were not seen as anyone's friends.
The Republicans had just gotten into power with an enormous mandate. I mean, they just issued a thrashing to Cox and Roosevelt in the 1920 election, the supposed successors of Wilson. So that was Democrats were down probably in their weakest to be able to criticize something. So you have some Western folks, maybe a few newspapers. So I wonder if that was before the 22 midterms or not.
That did come out before the midterms, but it was more of something of regional interest in those states where oil interests were disliked. It didn't come out that it was a bribe until January of 24. I don't know how in the weeds we want to get on how it was exposed. It's kind of funny that I will tell you a little that Albert Fall realized that a Senate committee was investigating the circumstances of the lease. He just had $100,000 to buy that ranch that he so loved in New Mexico. So he told a friend of his, who was actually the publisher of the Washington Post, "Hey, can you just tell everybody that you loaned me the money?" And the cover story might have held, but Thomas Walsh, who was the senator, who was also the chief investigator of the Teapot Dome Committee, and just to tell you how, I guess, little the Republicans really cared about this, they completely ran the Senate. They had the majority, but they let Walsh be their chief, I don't know what you would call him, not the chairman exactly, but the chief questioner, chief investigator of the committee. It just so happened that Walsh, who was a bachelor, or maybe he was a widower, was dating a socialite who was a friend of the publisher's wife. And the gossip was very clear. The publisher didn't have any money. He was completely broke. He could not have loaned this money. So the publisher was called in private to be questioned on this. And he finally just had to cave in and admit that, no, he had made up the story. So it gradually emerges over the course of several weeks that, he's not charged with a crime yet, but there's this incredibly fishy, there's got to have been bribery going on. And then this overlaps with a completely different committee, but it's investigating other Harding era scandals around the Department of Justice. And that determines that things involving the Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, are incredibly corrupt. He's been basically selling pardons. He's been basically selling permits to withdraw alcohol from government warehouses. This is prohibition. Obviously, alcohol is illegal. You can't buy or sell it. But if there's various purposes, whether it's medicinal or industrial purposes, you could withdraw it from government warehouses. Daugherty was selling this stuff. He was basically tied in with bootleggers and organized crime. And
so there's kind of a double scandal there that when we talk about Teapot Dome.
It is. There's even a triple scandal because there was upsetting things happening at the Veterans Bureau, which was a completely new agency because of the huge number of veterans and wounded veterans who were need permanent care, and that their hospitals that were being built for them were just complete ripoffs, just vast amounts of money being overspent on them, going to contractors, and even medicines being sold for profit.
There's a lot of money in the 20s, in the early going in the 20s, that's coming from the oil industry, and that's just so associated with this scandal. It's tied to the nominations that occur. It's tied to the 20 convention, but these people, is not present in other industries, and the potential for bribery and corruption is there, and there aren't as many safeguards anyway.
You don't have campaign finance regulations. I guess we could only imagine how much money was even spent on campaign.
The only ones policing the government is the government itself. And I think, again, coming in with a new administration when, they were given a blank check. But the 22 midterm goes bad for Harding, so I'm sure that gave Democrats a little boost. Walsh is really good. People loved Walsh. I know.
Was good. He was actually, I believe he was the keynote speaker at the convention that year.
He's the chairman. Yes. Of the convention.
Chairman of the convention, right.
There were a lot of folks that wanted him, and I don't think you would have had the deadlock if he was their star, and I don't think you would have had the deadlock that ended up occurring there if you had Walsh as the candidate, it would have been more consensus, but he didn't want to get involved in politics. It would ruin his investigation if he took a partisan side.
Right. There was a big exploding, big phenomenon that explodes into headlines. It becomes a catchphrase. But here's the interesting thing, which I think you're about to ask earlier, was the president who succeeds Harding is Coolidge, and he's very different from him. Harding, backslapper, not that involved, I take it, in like all the details of government. Coolidge, famous silent Cal, the guy who didn't like to talk much, wasn't super warm and charismatic, but really was into the details of government. Can't really be connected to financial scandal in any way. He's not looking to make a profit out of government. So it's hard to connect him personally with the scandal. Plus, Coolidge does a kind of clever thing when he announces very quickly that he's going to name special prosecutors to look into this. And he says they'll look into wrongdoing of whatever party may have done it. Now, there's only one party that's in government that has
Very
power over
clever.
these oil leases. It's the Republican Party. The reason he brings up both parties is when he testifies the very first week of the hearings, one of the oil men who was implicated in Teapot Dome, a guy named Edwin Doheny, says, and at the prompting of the Republican members of the committee, well, I've hired William McAdoo as to be my lawyer with all my Mexican oil business, which is true. He was, but he had nothing to do with Teapot Dome. He certainly wouldn't have had any power to secure any rights in the U.S. He did work in Mexico. So what you get is a lot of cartoons that just show Democratic donkey, Republican elephant, all smeared in oil, all tarred by scandal. McAdoo and Albert Fall kind of put on the same level. Of course, McAdoo was considered quasi front runner. I think a lot of people didn't.
Let's say so.
He was the most famous, most powerful of the candidates, but a lot of people knew he probably wasn't going to get the nomination. There was too much opposition to him. But this kind of clinched it that he wasn't going to get it, that he was just too wrapped up with Wall Street interests and with this new fact that he had all this legal fees from a crooked oil businessman.
Harding dies in 23. And
Right.
so before this year starts that we're talking about, the president that was elected in 20 dies. The vice president has taken over. He, as you say, can sort of wash his hands a little of this scandal without some of that baggage. I mean, I'm sure Democrats try to stick it on him.
They really did. That actually becomes the eventual nominee is John W. Davis. He's like the compromise nominee. And I think you've done an episode on the 1924 Democratic Convention. This is not a very famous name, John W. Davis. It's not a huge impact in history that he makes. But he does hammer the scandal and he does make a pretty vigorous attempt at campaigning. We just really don't know about it because he didn't win and there's no great turning point, I think, that this election really represents.
I did a whole episode on John W. Davis, actually, and we'll re-air it later in the year.
It gets doubled up because, there's a third party this year. There's Robert La Follette, who's nominally a Republican. He runs as the Progressive Party candidate, the third party candidate. And he is spending basically most of his time attacking the Republican administration as corrupt, as Wall Street influenced, saying how he'll cure all the problems by social reform, nationalizing railroads, talk that really scares Republicans. But with all that given, the Republicans had a huge advantage and they just played it right. They won pretty easily, even though they had the double opposition.
It's a crazy year, considering the size of a scandal. And I think 1924 is an example of if all you have is a big scandal, that might not be enough to anchor a loss, believe it or not, as bad as a scandal might be. Now, there's, of course, a lot of caveats there because Harding's not alive. So right there, you lose the person to pin it on. Even he would have said, I didn't know about this. And that's not a great presidential defense, though. There are other good things happening. Economy was getting a lot better. Things had been very bad in the last few years of the Wilson administration, and people didn't want to really go back. So you had a lot of things there. I see parallels in what you're saying with Bush and Coolidge. So Bush in 1988 is running as a vice president. Of course, the
He was out
president
of
was
the
still
loop.
alive. Yes. And he was trying to avoid getting wrapped up in the Iran-Contra scandal. You had a little bit more there with Bush. In fact, I think there was a lot more there than ever came out. Some of it didn't come out till the 92 election, but they eventually, the funny thing is, because vice presidents now in the modern time are more involved, the negative side of that is when a scandal hits the White House, you can pin more on a VP. But back in 23 with old Coolidge, he could very reliably say, I've got nothing to do with this. I'm just the vice president. George H.W. Bush is sitting there in national security meetings with some of the people that are doing the Iran-Contra. So I think the Walsh report showed many years later that there was much more involvement that probably wouldn't have permitted him to go forward in the 88 race. But, that's a side note, but it's definitely worthy of contrast.
There's another side note that I kind of like, just because it's one of those hidden corners, or I don't know if you call it a what if of history, but it is, there's an aspect of it. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., he's like his dad in so many ways. He is a war hero, the assistant secretary of the Navy. In fact, he's one of 3 Roosevelts who have been assistant secretary of the Navy, because, his dad, Theodore Sr., held that title. He did, and so did his cousin Franklin. 2 of the 3, Franklin and Theodore, of course, become president. And it looks like Theodore Roosevelt Jr. might be on the track to being a president. He's got the name, he's got the money, seems to have got very good political skills. And in 1924, he declares he's running for governor of New York. Very, even big job now, even bigger job then. The biggest state, very crucial to a Coolidge win, because New York is the ultimate battleground state at the time. Theodore Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had to approve that oil lease transfer, the transfer to the Interior Department. And that doesn't look so good. Also, his brother, Archie, another one of Theodore's sons, he had been a director either a director or an executive at Doheny Oil Company, one of the ones that was giving the bribes, and he had to resign that. So I don't know if you call it a what if, because Al Smith is the guy he lost to. Al Smith was a very, very popular governor, Democratic governor in 1924, one of those many possible candidates for president at that convention that year. But Smith beats him in a year when also Coolidge, on the Republican ticket, wins not just New York, but he wins New York City. In fact, he's the last Republican nominee to have ever done that, to have carried New York City. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. goes down to this defeat. This governor's race, I don't think he ever runs for an elected office again, but he does. What he does do is he becomes a general. He hits the beaches at D-Day in 1944. He dies like a few weeks later of a heart attack. And I think both he and his father also get the Medal of Honor for different wars, which I think is their only father-son combination ever to have done that.
I mean, the Roosevelt family gave a lot. There's Quentin Roosevelt in World War I in the Air Service. Teddy Roosevelt's Jr.'s potential career. I think he had some flaws. I don't know how far they would have taken him, but politics is a lot about names, especially then, and he had the name. For my favorite story of that election is that Eleanor Roosevelt, whereas we talked about she would have been in the papers at this time as Mrs. F.D. Roosevelt, was riding around in the car with a big teapot on top of it, campaigning against that side of their family, the Republican side, and to ensure the defeat. That side of the Roosevelts were very much against him running. So Teapot Dome does end one career, but doesn't end Coolidge's. While this big national scandal is in America, there's other great stuff going on. Like radio has just exploded, from this kind of like novelty, the way podcasting was in the early 2000s, to something everyone's doing, the way podcasting is now, from this thing that, hey, Bruce, what's that thing you do? What's that big white box you're carrying around? To I go to the pizza shop and they're like, yeah, I started a podcast, it's no big deal. Just need a microphone. I'm like, my God, do you know what I had to do in 2006 to get this thing to be able to hear sound from a. Okay, anyway, I can only imagine that that's the same progress with radio, where in the early, it's like kit boxes for the 1916 election and hobby stuff for electronics enthusiasts. And now, by the time you get into 24, it's a household item and everybody's listening. Then you got cars, trucks, built lighting.
Right. One of my favorite radio stories, probably from that Democratic convention, which, again, you've done the episode on. We know, probably a lot of political junkies know, longest convention ever. Took 103 ballots, right, for the Democrats to get their nominee, which I think is 2 weeks. And it created, I guess, I don't know if you call it the first meme exactly, but one of the details I loved was finding that, and I don't remember his name, but the head of Alabama's delegation, but whoever the head of their delegation was, would announce the roll call. And because Alabama's alphabetically first, all the radio audiences, the radio listeners would be waiting for it to start. And this guy, who I guess had a fairly stentorian voice, would call out, "Alabama casts its 25 or whatever number votes for Oscar Underwood." And this became like a sort of thing people would repeat and laugh about. And they would like, "Oh, love this guy, hearing this guy's voice."
Yeah, it's a strange, and I'm sure that's the only votes he got.
Actually, no, I think he was a fairly strong contender, maybe like in the middle ranks. He was kind of an interesting person because he was considered actually the strongest anti-Ku Klux Klan candidate coming from Alabama, where you would think, oh, well, let's write that off. That's like the land of white supremacy politics. But being against the Klan didn't necessarily mean you were for racial equality. It meant here's the secret threatening group. Yeah.
That was a lot of the opponents. They would say, I'm against secret groups. It allowed people to wiggle a lot, too much at times. I'm against secret groups and not really attack the particular secret group that's burning crosses on people's lawns. But okay, yeah, you're against secret groups, like acting like it's the Masons or something. Yeah, you got to salute Oscar Underwood for that, given where he came from. That's the other thing to talk about. In addition to kind of Teapot Dome and radio and the economy, the Klan has a hold on America at this time, and it's not the Klan in the South that had appeared after Reconstruction. It's kind of a new type of Klan. I was reading a book about Asbury Park, New Jersey at this time, and they had Asbury Park itself, that town would not allow them there, but the nearby town of Long Branch had the Klan parade, and there would be family picnics, and the Klan would march in their robes, not in the middle of the night burning things, but right in the daylight on the beach in the summer when everyone was there, having a good old-fashioned, good family parade, and standing up against all those new immigrants and Catholics. And also, it almost seemed like the secondary priority of the 1920s Klan was racial, hatred.
Actually, it almost seems like race doesn't come up at all when you're reading like a lot of their manifestos or controversies about it. It's the people who really, really hate the Klan are Catholics for obvious reasons. They're accused of being traitors or like second-class Americans. And there's like various, basically riots. There are people attacking Klan meetings. It's usually happening in, I don't know about usually, but it's often happening in these like small towns where a lot of like immigrants or sons of immigrants are working in mines or some heavy industry there, and really resents these people as basically like an enemy coming to threaten you. There was at least 3 like very, very violent riots, some involving deaths, that happened in at least 2 in rural Pennsylvania, 1 in Massachusetts. And one of the things you'll notice too is a lot of these are sort of what we would now call both sidesing. We condemn these forces of secrecy and bigotry and intolerance. We also condemn the lawlessness of the people who fight them. Or just an absolutely like mind-boggling story, which is 100% true, was the Valparaiso University, famous pretty well-known, well-regarded school in Indiana now. At the time, so bankrupt and so in trouble that they agreed to be sold to the Ku Klux Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan was actually going to operate a university, and excited a lot of comment. Actually, a lot of it sort of like almost comical, like cartoons showing like, here's what a Ku Klux Klan course in college with lots of K's would look like. And just the ultimate, like absolutely flabbergasting, both-siding article that I found came from the Literary Digest, which basically praised this as, well, it's great. If they get to operate a university, we can hear from all sides.
Oh, I mean, I think though that it
never happened. By the way, it never came through with it in large part because the Ku Klux Klan was always basically a Ponzi scheme. They were never going to become like a going business when the whole point was
I think it starts as an absolute Ponzi scheme. It's a salesman in Alabama who finds a way to revive it and start selling stuff, but he loses control of it, and it becomes various large grand wizards with lots of political power. Got to talk about Indiana, entire states basically controlled by them, and it's actually Democrats running against the Klan there. But then in southern states, you have the Democratic Klan. You have Klan is very powerful in New Jersey, and that the association would be largely with Republicans there. But if you go to, say, Dallas, now you've got both Republicans and Democrats in the Texas Klan involved, and in the various southern states, you have a strong Democratic contingent. I mean, so it's a bipartisan, very politically involved, very open. There's a large march in D.C. during the 1920s where we've seen photos of.
Very famous photos of the march down Pennsylvania Avenue, right, with the Capitol in the background. I can find a photo for almost just about any week of the year, to the point where it sometimes becomes repetitive of, here's a Klan picnic in Wisconsin. Here's a Klan seashore gathering in New Jersey. Here's a Klan parade in Maine. It just goes on and on and on. And I actually just run every photo that I basically find because, hey, this is what's going on. These are the photos.
Yeah, and I think all you're getting from it is that we must assume that this negative connotation that we have today was not that it was unpresent, but it was not present in the way that we have it. Our modern view of that Klan is just merely, at that time, one partisan position. Almost the way one would view a political party today. Well, you may feel that way, but there's other people that don't. There's other people that think that they're purifying the country and there's too many immigrants. Of course, there was a huge wave of immigration that occurred prior to 1924 and had just started to end with various legislation. So it's
good you mentioned that. That's one of the most significant events of 1924. That is the year of the Johnson Immigration Act. That's the one that lowers the immigration quotas to basically the lowest they'd ever been. It sets back the percentage of people who are allowed to arrive in the U.S. at basically the levels of whatever was in the 1890 census. Basically guarantees there will hardly be any Italians, Jews, Russians, people from Eastern or Southern Europe. And it isn't even particularly controversial. I don't think you simply can't find it just as a Democratic versus Republican debate. Both parties vote for it in huge numbers. There are Jewish groups that speak out about it loudly. You can read those opinions. There are good government types, people who would have supported the League of Nations, who think this is a bad idea. And a lot of it actually also centered around Japan, because it's an explicit racist ban on any Japanese coming to the U.S. at all. This is partly controversial because it's an insult to Japan, and it increases the chances of war, but it isn't, again, framed as, oh, this is racist. This is a bad idea because we're excluding an entire race.
And in all this context, I think, we should talk the party conventions, since you have 3 of them, right? And I think even though whether I'll ignore chronology for a moment and just say, let's start with the one that people know of, and that's the Democratic Convention, right? And then we know the story. It goes on for a long time. They can't decide on a nominee, and the Klan is involved in that one. What would you say about the Klan presence in the Democratic convention in 1924.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means. It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop early holiday deals now.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Because I think there's some
I think you may have tackled. I'm sure you've tackled this on previous episodes, but it is worth going into. The Klan absolutely dominates the Democratic convention, not as there's a lot of Klansmen here, but as an issue. They talk about it endlessly. It actually is one of the reasons the whole convention goes off the rails and it goes 103 ballots, is because people are very divided. And it isn't even necessarily, I'm for the Klan, I'm against the Klan. It's, do we use our platform to condemn the Ku Klux Klan by name, or do we say intolerance is bad? Which is, a sort of implicit way of criticizing the Ku Klux Klan. The Democratic Platform Committee, it adopts a platform that's kind of general, that says intolerance is bad. It doesn't name any specific groups, but there's a minority that wants, hey, we want the Ku Klux Klan to be named. They have a day-long debate, and famously, this idea that we should name the Ku Klux Klan and criticize it is defeated, but it's only defeated by one vote. In fact, it's defeated by less than one vote. I don't remember the exact total, but they used fractional votes back then. Like you could cast 1/4 of a vote or 1/8 of a vote. So it actually, this is defeated by less than one vote. Something like 5/8 of a vote.
I keep forgetting how that works, why that occurs.
It sets a pretty bad tone, because now we have the people who are for Al Smith, who was very anti-Klan. He's also, this is important, he's very, what they would call soft on prohibition. He's not explicitly anti-prohibition, although you might think that now. He's like, we should make exceptions to prohibition. We should allow people to have beer. Versus the Dries. Those are the people who favor McAdoo, who are very strongly in favor of prohibition enforcement.
There's a connection there, by the way. Connection there between Klan and prohibition.
Absolutely. Everything's tied together. Your views on immigration, whether you're city or country, whether you distrust Wall Street or, you consider yourself a person of the farm.
As we've talked about so many times here, prohibitionists are not necessarily teetotalers. That's two different things.
Right.
They want other people to not drink.
There's talk of this being the Klan convention, but what they mean by that is not, the Klan is running this convention. It's they cannot get themselves out of this mess over what to say or do about the Ku Klux Klan. Now, what actually happens when Davis is nominated, one of the first things he does, he goes out and gives a speech where he specifically condemns the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he doesn't do it because, we go over this, he doesn't do it because he says, I disagree with their views on race, that I believe blacks and whites deserve equal protection as citizens. He attacks them for being a secret group, for mob violence. But he does attack them. And Coolidge, the Republican nominee, never does this. Coolidge says he's for tolerance. He even makes, I guess we could call fairly nice gestures toward black voters by saying, I support people of any race to advance themselves. He supports a black candidate for Congress in New York. It's actually the first time I think a new person ever ran for Congress from New York who was black, and he was a Republican. He lost, but he lost narrowly. That's the thing that people don't remember is Democrats actually, the candidate actually did specifically denounce the Klan.
I think that, we did a whole series. John Davis also ran, and that's absolutely the case. Coolidge, yeah, you got to give him a little credit there for some of his statements. He was often somebody who would bring up the service of black soldiers during World War II. During World War One, or the Great War. He was fond of bringing that up. But I do think it's important to point out that on this Klan issue, so in modern times, I don't know if we're past it. We're getting a little past it, but there was a huge meme war around this 1924 Democratic Convention where it was the clam bake.
It wouldn't die.
Would not die. It's a confusion between a big contentious debate at a meeting and it was being turned into, in modern times, this was like a meeting that the Klan ran. No, it was, the reason it was so contentious is because the Smith forces were absolutely looking to condemn the Klan. Smith was Catholic and and there were forces that wanted to run a Catholic as the presidential nominee of the party. So it's now, you could say, of course, you could make the argument that the Klan was very influential at the Democratic Convention because at least one half of it, but there were also people shouting at them from the balconies, like condemning the Klan during this convention. And then, of course, there was that picture that the people walking down the sidewalk. And I love this picture. Yes. So I said, here's a picture of Klan members at the 1924 Democratic Convention. And I was presented with this on my Facebook site once, and I merely just wrote in a comment, the 1924 Democratic Convention was held inside. So that's the first thing wrong with it. But of course, it turns out that photo's not even from, I'm not even sure it's from
New York.
Not from New York City. That probably wouldn't have happened in the city without some police intervention.
So often when I was reading accounts of the Democratic Conventions that they called it the Klan bake, which it's very compelling because that's just a great pun, right? Klan bake. And you will see like very serious and good historians who will use that term, partly because it's hard to avoid. It just got in the mix. Now, when you actually search, because you can do a database search for newspapers, you find exactly one newspaper that used the term Klan bake. It was the New York Daily News. And they did it in a context that it's not even clear what they were talking about because, a lot of this like jazz age language is like very rootin' tootin' goofy.
You're right about that.
It doesn't always translate well. They're talking about like expect a hot time at the Klan bake at 10:30 a.m. when the Rules Committee meets. Now, around, I think 2000 or 2001, a Daily News guy wrote a history of the 20s, like a serialized history. He must have come upon that and like, that's a great line. It is a good line. He used it. And I think that's what sort of started this meme of, they called it the Klan bake. Well, one newspaper called it that in an uncertain context, but nobody, again, would have suggested at the time that, oh my God, the convention is filled with hooded Klansmen.
Yeah, my understanding of it, and I don't know whether it ended up in that book, the seminal book on the 103 ballots or whatever.
No, I don't think it's present there at all.
It's not present in there. Okay. But I think, if anything, what they're referring to is the fact that, first of all, it's July. It's hot. It's New York City. Gets hot like everywhere.
And there's just some great photos of people sweating buckets.
They're sweating, and I think
William Jennings Bryan, like just looking like he's death warmed over, fanning himself with one of those palm leaf fans.
And I think you should bring up that Bryan is one of these people when we talk about, Bryan's a tough one because when people, if they hear the early history, and some people, especially of a progressive mindset, will get real excited. And well, they should, because he is definitely a force of introducing progressive ideas into the Democratic Party. And he has all of that. But you got to watch out how close you hug William Jennings Bryan, because he's one of these people who we described earlier, who are in that middle ground, the wormy ground, when it involves the Klan.
At this time, he's living in Florida. And there was an account. This, of course, in the year 2024 would be like broadcast all over the world. That's a shocking event. But in 1923, he takes part in like a committee that's like, or a reviewing stand for a parade. And they like give their first prize for like best float to the Ku Klux Klan. So yeah, he's not great on this issue, but he never actually says like I like the Klan. You read
he's
his
one of these
comments.
he's one of these I think we shouldn't be calling anybody out in particular.
Yes.
And we shouldn't alienate other people. It's kind of like other people have
Right.
this view. And I do believe his daughter ends up speaking out against the Klan, and in later years
right.
the Klan's a little disappointed. They would have liked more "thank you very much" out of Brian.
Oh,
but,
and something we absolutely have to mention, which I didn't get out there yet, was that the Democratic ticket in 1924. It's Davis, who we talked about, the vice presidential nominee, Charles Bryan. That's William Jennings Bryan's brother. And that's actually a little fun trivia. Only time brothers have been on the ticket. Those are the only brothers, William and Charles Bryan. They're never happened with the Kennedys, didn't happen with the Bushes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So that
Charles Bryan he's basically picked. Obviously, it's a ticket balancing move because John Davis is a Wall Street lawyer. He's from New York. Actually, he's from West Virginia, but he lives in New York. He's associated with New York. Bryan is a very famous family, and it's related to the farmer. And I'm against Wall Street. I'm for pure progressivism and against the power of the Supreme Court and the bankers. And there's a very arcane thing, which apparently was taken very seriously at the time, was the idea that there could be an electoral deadlock. That's the sort of thing that's always possible when there's a strong third party, right? The idea was La Follette, who was guaranteed to win Wisconsin because he was super popular there in his home state. The idea was he was also going to get lots of the prairie states. He was going to get the Dakotas, Minnesota. He might even get the Pacific Northwest. And there would be an electoral deadlock. The House would meet. They wouldn't be able to vote for a president. Then the Senate would meet. As you know, the Senate is the one that elects the vice president. And the Senate would then go for Charles Bryan, elect him vice president, and he'd become acting president with the House. Now, it's still deadlocked. And this was actually taken seriously. And some Republicans were accusing the Democrats of plotting this as a strategy. And, never happened, of course, but
Democrats certainly would have been pro Bryan at the. It's a good time for that.
Right.
No, I think so. So we have that story. I think that New York Democratic Convention, because of its length, goes down in the history books. Of course, we covered the fact that it's all on radio and everybody's listening. And to me, it was something I thought about when people were saying, "Hey, why don't the Democrats have an open convention and everybody can watch it and it'll get great TV ratings? We'll even raise money."
The Thunderdome, as it's been called.
Because
this
not
was
only
in 1924, that was a pure Thunderdome. In fact, what's funny is the Republicans, right? You think by contrast, they're the slick, well-oiled machine, the one that's run by money. And their nominee was obvious. It was always going to be Coolidge. He's the incumbent president. Well, they kind of had their own Thunderdome. It wasn't quite as exciting or as strange, but they didn't really agree on who the vice presidential nominee was going to be. I guess the president at the time couldn't just command it. He wouldn't just get up at a speech like they do today. He's like, "Here's my choice," and that person is just instantly becomes the vice presidential nominee. No, you have to vote on it as delegates. And apparently, Coolidge wanted William Borah to be his vice president, which was a very interesting choice because Borah was a completely different wing of the party.
Reaching
much
out
more
to
progressive. Right.
Yeah.
I believe he was like a bull mooser. He had bolted the Republican Party back in 1912. And Borah said, "No, thanks." They kind of went in not knowing exactly what to do. They wanted, because Coolidge, of course, is from New England, they wanted to balance it with someone from the West. So they nominate Frank Loudon, governor of Illinois, or former governor of Illinois. And then something very weird happens. Loudon says, "No, I don't want the job. I refuse to accept your nomination." And apparently he had even said before the convention, "I don't want it." But they thought he was playing coy, or they thought that if they gave him the nomination, he would accept it. But it was final. So they went back and had a third ballot because he had been picked on 2 ballots. They went back and had a third ballot, and then they nominated someone else from Illinois, Charles Dawes. the very unusual situation. I think it only happened one other time at a convention that somebody declined a nomination.
Yeah,
it happened in like the 1840s.
It's oh yeah, that's right, Silas Wright. But yeah,
that's right.
That's an interesting situation. I think it's important to talk about the RNC in Cleveland because so much gets talked about nowadays as if only the Democratic Convention occurs in 1924, 100 years ago. Can't believe it's 100 years ago. Wow.
It's a pure like Dems in disarray, Republicans in array. There was simply no talk of having a platform that would say anything about the Ku Klux Klan, and it didn't. I read
a little bit from Time Magazine. So Time Magazine around the time of June 1924, as Coolidge is about to be renominated, this is the headline: Ku Klux Klan, and with a K, Cleveland, and with a K again, Convention. This is the headline, and this issue of Time Magazine has the picture of the Grand Wizard of the Klan, Edwards, on the front cover. And the Cleveland, and this is the article, of short one. Many men went to Cleveland hoping to put an anti-Ku Klux Klan plank in the Republican platform. They had prepared a plank which read thus: "This party pledges itself and its candidates to stand inflexibly for government by due process of law and against all groups, open or secret, which attempt to take the law into its own hands." There's more, and also it's against prejudice or discrimination of any citizens, the basis of race, color, or creed. Right. This would be a no-brainer for 2024 in any party's platform, but this thing does not reach the floor of the 1924.
It doesn't. And therefore doesn't become a story. Doesn't become a controversy.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier how Davis, the Democratic nominee, he goes and very promptly makes an anti-Klan speech to his credit. I guess to the Republicans' credit, their vice presidential nominee, Dawes, he actually follows him up and says, well, I'm going to make an anti-Klan statement of my own. He kind of does it impromptu. He's speaking somewhere in New England, and he decides, I'm going to go off script. I'm going to say something about it. And Dawes has a reputation. He was kind of a hothead. A lot of people loved him for it. They said, oh, he's a plain-spoken folk. But in this case, when he went and denounced the Klan, I'm not sure it helped them that much, because he kind of framed it as these are terrible. The Klan is terrible people, but they've been provoked by all the radicalism and all the craziness that's happened in America since the war. Yeah. So he's almost excusing the behavior.
It's a little both sides.
La Follette, the progressive candidate, La Follette calls him out very quickly on it, saying that's not a real denunciation of the Klan.
This busy season, get ahead with Indeed Flex. Instantly access thousands of quality, pre-verified workers locally, smart match to your preferences. Build an engaged and consistent workforce on demand. Easily post jobs, choose workers, manage timesheets, and rate performance. Text podcast to 79057. That's podcast to 79057. Or visit IndeedFlex.com/podcast to access temp workers today.
Yeah, but did La Follette really... So you have these three voices. How much did La Follette go after the Klan?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure. He certainly didn't make it a top. He did not
I think
make it a
Davis
top,
was out
item.
there. I think in this election, Davis was the stronger. So there's a lot of wiggling. A lot of wiggling.
Yeah. There was a lot of talk that wasn't realized that La Follette was going to get a lot of the urban vote, and he just didn't.
We have this attempt. In Texas, there's a fellow named R.B. Krieger, and I love the opportunity to bring it up because I think I've only brought this one up in my maybe in the Davis cast or maybe on Patreon stuff. But this guy in Texas who's a Republican, and he's like, we have a real chance in Texas to start a Republican Party here. As it was, he would be 50 years off. But
I think they did come close that year, but partly that was the odd circumstance that they ran a woman for governor. First woman ever elected governor, by the way, Ma Ferguson. Her husband was Pa Ferguson. He'd been a governor before her. And one of the reasons she ran was he couldn't run again. He'd been impeached and barred from ever running again. She ran basically in his place. There's like a suggestion, she's just his puppet. I don't think she ever like explicitly she never said, "Oh, I'll just do what he says," which is what George Wallace's wife did when she ran for governor, because George Wallace couldn't. No, she kind of made it sound like she was her own person, but crucially, she campaigned against the Ku Klux Klan. She said, "I'm the anti-Klan Democrat in the primary," which is important, right? Because who wins the primary is almost equivalent to your elected governor of Texas at the time. And funny, you can't make this up. One of the people she beats in the primary was named Lynch. By the time the general election happens, though, it was actually, I think it was kind of a close race, maybe 10 points, something like that she beats the Republican candidate. And probably a lot of that was people uncomfortable voting for a woman at the time.
Now, Coolidge does not do well in Texas. I mean, all those southern states, it's not so much. Yeah,
it's a solid South, right?
Solid South. It's not so much popular opinion, although there's certainly some of that. Certainly people are born voting Democrat, voting where they shot or where their grandfather shot. But this is political machines that are almost, making it almost difficult to vote Republican in places. He gets about 20% of the vote. But this guy, Krieger, who's a friend of Harding, trying to build a party in Texas, kind of says, even to his own state chairman and everything, like, hey, we can run as an anti-Klan party and possibly take the state. The Klan is not as popular here as you think. He says, look at this. They say, 20 million foreigners, 16 million Catholics, 10 million African Americans, 4 million Jews are proscribed by the Klan. That's 50 million people. Why don't we appeal to this crew?
He's obviously talking about the U.S., not Texas at the time.
As Time magazine says, it carried the inference that the party which opposed the Klan could win the support of half the people in the country. And the Republican Party was unpersuaded, and he went away somewhat discomfited. However, Dr. Hiram Wesley Evans, who is also from Texas, a dentist by profession, was the current imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And so Evans is there not at the convention floor, of course, but he's in a house on Euclid Avenue, not far from the convention. They talk about it here. He actually tries to appoint a guy vice president. Let's see, it was Senator Jim Watson of Indiana, and Indiana's a very Klan-influenced state. I'm not saying that Watson was a member of the Klan or anything, but the politics are influenced. And Watson, incidentally, during that whole Loudon and other controversy, and he says, are you trying to kill me politically? I don't want this. I don't want this endorsement.
Right. Yeah, that happens even in the South. Like people attack each other in Democratic primaries, saying the other one's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Nobody waves around their affiliation with it.
So he ends up now, the Klan master, Evans, has to issue a statement from this house that he's staying at in Cleveland saying, we have not nominated any man to the office of president or vice president, signed the imperial wizard of the Klan. Of course, Watson, who declines the nomination handed to him that way, is also one of these wiggle mouth people that we talked about, is like, no, I don't think any particular organization should be called out, and all of that. So, but we have the presence of the Klan certainly in the Republican convention in 1924, even if you can't make a honest argument that there's an association there with Coolidge himself. But certainly both conventions, and this is what I think gets lost in history about 100 years ago, is that election is that the Klan's everywhere.
Interesting. A few other oddities I guess you could throw in about the campaign, and you can find this very easily by Googling it. It's the first time you will hear candidates speaking on film. A lot of us think the sound movies don't come until the late 20s, like 1927 is the year of The Jazz Singer, the movie that famously revolutionized movies and made everything had to be in sound after The Jazz Singer. Well, they actually had the technology to make sound movies quite a bit earlier. Nobody wanted to rebuild movie theaters to accommodate it and change all the projection and the type of film they were using, because of course it requires a soundtrack on the film. The guy, inventor Lee DeForest, who's kind of a controversial figure in himself, but created a company called Phonofilm, and he was going to make sound movies. And one of the first things he needed to do to make this thing legitimate was get all the candidates to speak on film. So you can find some great footage of, only two of the candidates, Coolidge, who is clearly not enjoying himself in this clip. You can sort of see why they called him Silent Cal. He looks actually annoyed. And La Follette, who is just like exploding with oratory. And I read an account of when he actually made the film. He said he had never spoken on the radio before, or even in front of any amplifying equipment when he did it. This was a completely new thing to him, but he actually comes across pretty well, I think, in the clip. They also made a sound movie where Davis, the Democratic nominee, speaks, but that apparently is lost. A lot of lost movies from that era.
Yeah, so I must correct the record that at least I know that La Follette did make an anti-Klan statement in August of 1924. I still don't think that he spent a lot of this, particularly the end of the campaign. I've seen references by different journal article writers where, there might have been a little less vigor towards the end when he thought maybe he had more chance of either winning or forcing things into the House if he got Democratic votes.
Right.
But
it was a pretty remarkable effort he made, considering he dies less than a year later.
What do you think?
He was 69 or 70 and he died.
What would you say? What about connection to Theodore Roosevelt there? Is he the lineage of the 1912 run, or did he move?
Party has the same name. They both called themselves progressives, but actually, there's articles from after he's nominated by an organization that names itself the Progressive Party. It's not like a convention in the sense of, the big parties. It's not a lot of delegates. It's a few people. It's more of like a committee that meets and names them. And a lot of the people who are veterans of the Theodore Roosevelt campaign denounce him and say, no, you're not a real progressive. A real progressive stands for this and that and the other thing that Theodore Roosevelt stood for. Because La Follette's actually way more radical. Like, he thinks the government should take over railroads. He thinks that Congress should be able to override Supreme Court on certain votes. Back then, the Supreme Court, very, very hated by progressives because it's always stepping in to help big business, to curb the power of labor unions, to call labor unions like this conspiracy.
100 years ago, progressives don't like the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Nothing changes, right?
We made a bit of a U-turn along the way.
Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 solution was a little more like a referendum only,
right.
And only on if they overturned congressional law, not for every decision. So he was very conservative about his progressiveness compared to La Follette there.
Right. I think there's the new factor that wasn't around when the 1912 Theodore Roosevelt campaign is there's now Soviet Russia, and they are terrifying people. Legitimately, they, after all, did kill like a huge number of people in their civil war. They were like telling everyone who would listen that they were going to have a world revolution. And La Follette, he's definitely not a communist. In fact, he prohibits any communist from being at his convention. But he's kind of friendly. He thinks, we should have relations with Russia. I think that is one of the biggest factors, that people just call him a freak and a radical. In fact, the Republican campaigners around September, at least, which is where I'm reading some of the articles now. I haven't read my way all the way up to October, but they are attacking La Follette way more than they're attacking Davis, the Democratic candidate.
Hey, let me ask about that. So when you do your thing on Twitter, you're doing a lot of stuff in advance, right? I mean, you're probably like reading ahead of time, and because you're doing well. Let me just explain what you do.
Sure.
You'll have stories from today, 100 years ago on your Twitter feed, but a lot of that you're kind of reading a couple months ahead sometimes.
Yeah, it's kind of necessary because sometimes things get reported later than you like.
And yours is not just a blind. You're doing some editing. You're picking. You're reading. It's not just one of these like, hey, here's the exact news feed from 100 years ago.
Yeah, if you just picked what was on the front pages every day, I think it would get very boring very fast because nobody cares about the ins and outs of what every candidate is saying every day, what congressional committee might be voting on what tariff. But there are, there's lots of fun discoveries that can make about, like I said, about the movies that may have come out where the candidates are speaking, or what movies have been released, or what future famous person might have appeared in a movie. Like, I wasn't even aware that W.C. Fields was actually a pretty big star of the silent movie era, which is almost incomprehensible because you can't imagine him not talking in a movie. But there he is. He's a huge star of first Broadway in vaudeville in the early 1920s. And then he makes his first movie around this time. Same for, Garbo. We know that she was in Silence because when she spoke, it was a big deal. But her making her first appearance in movies when she's a teenager.
So, I mean, of course, the election ends up being, is there any kind of suspense in the election, or is it pretty much as we as moderns understands it?
No, I think you've talked about it as fundamentals. Fundamentals often determine the election. The country was at peace, very prosperous. Another factor, I think, was there was a big farming depression in the 1920s, right? Which is actually, a lot of people think, was a great contributor to the Great Depression eventually. So much of the country is rural, but actually prices were going up in 1924. So farmers weren't even doing that poorly compared to earlier in the decade.
Chicken in every pot.
Yeah. And another big factor, United Party versus a divided party. Incumbent versus a guy who wasn't even that very famous.
Yeah, the only thing Coolidge had, he could dodge personally the attachment to the scandal, and the only thing he had was a third party challenger, but pretty easily disposed of, and then bad
people who like those websites that do betting odds on the election or futures. I was surprised to see this, that Wall Street betting odds are quoted almost every day on who's going to win the election. Coolidge is always a favorite in these polls, always. They're taking bets on who might be nominated and of what I again said was the weird, 3D chess move of that Charles Bryan becomes president, the vice presidential nominee.
Well, I think they were the kind of polls of the day, even though you were starting to get regular polls at that point in local areas, at least. But
the Literary Digest was famous at the time that it ran the most famous poll, but it was insanely not a scientific poll because it depended on you mailing ballots to the magazine, and so they would trumpet these huge numbers. We received this many million ballots. They would update it every week to tell you who was leading the poll and which states which candidate was going to win which state. And it even became it was so much attention was paid to it that I see accusations in some articles from Democrats in certain states, think out west, that Republican postal officials or postmasters are stuffing the ballot for the Literary Digest poll, that they're sending in extra ballots. And
I think
we know famously that the Literary Digest poll was it was actually accurate up until it wasn't in 1936 when they said Alf Landon of all candidates was going to be FDR, the guy who lost 46 out of 48 states.
Yeah, it's amazing how far that went. So let me ask you this. What did we miss? What did we not talk about that we should have talked about?
I guess we didn't talk about anything outside the U.S., but I guess that is not your area.
I don't mind talking about it. I'm not against it. There's two extremely ominous developments. One is Hitler's beer hall putsch. I don't need to go into all the details of that, but 1924 is the year that Hitler goes on trial for treason in Germany, and it's basically a slam dunk case. There is no argument that he did not attempt to overthrow the German state. He went onto the podium at the beer hall and declared the German state is overthrown, and here's the new government. But he appeals to the court's sympathy by saying, "Oh well, I'm a German patriot. I'm a veteran.
And he gets a famous suspended, or not suspended, but incredibly brief sentence of 5 years with a certainty of parole in less than a year. He goes to the famous cushy jail cell at Landsberg prison where he writes Mein Kampf, gets all of his Nazi toadies to like pay him visits every day, dictate his memoirs to them, make like declarations. And this was, Hitler is not an unknown figure. He's because of that beer hall putsch, things that in the trial make headlines here in the U.S. They also start spelling Hitler's name right. He was Hittler through most of 1923, but he's become a headline name this early. Now, he is seen as maybe a bit of a clown, but after that verdict, where it was considered pretty shocking at the time that he got such a light sentence. And it happened on April 1st. So articles in the papers say Germans regard this as a great April Fool's joke. Now, also overseas, we have the other famous fascist, Mussolini, and that's the year he basically solidifies that he's going to be dictator for life. What happens in Italy, it's kind of unlike Germany, where when the Nazis took over, they took over and they shut down everything that wasn't Nazi, that was representative government. In Italy, didn't work that way. It was a very slow, almost legal, it was legal, a legal takeover where in 1922, Mussolini is asked to become prime minister. His fascist party doesn't have anything close to a majority, but they're seen as strong. The king doesn't want the communists to have any say in the cabinet, so he thinks Mussolini's there are elections in 1924, and they're basically completely rigged. They're done under this insane system which says whoever gets the most votes, keep in mind this is a cabinet system, or, I guess you call it Westminster voting system with districts. Under this system, whoever gets the plurality, doesn't matter really how big it is. Maybe, I think maybe you have to clear a certain threshold. You will get 2/3 of the seats in parliament. To add to this, there's other sort of arcane tricks he does to guarantee that anyone who's not a fascist isn't going to get anywhere close to that. And he aligns with other conservative right-wing parties to form a national list that wins. Then there's a socialist member of parliament, a young, very charismatic lawyer named Matteotti. He rises in parliament. He denounces this. He says this is a corrupt election. It isn't the legalities of the whole thing, which were quasi-legal. It's the fact that the fascists did like massive voter intimidation. They were basically telling people we're going to shoot you if you don't vote the fascist list. After Matteotti makes this speech, his friends give him a backslap. Say, that was great. He says, that's great. Now start preparing my eulogy, which is very prescient because after 2 weeks, he is murdered. He's kidnapped in broad daylight in Rome by what's very easily to figure out is a fascist hit squad. In fact, they're so sloppy that everyone can read the license plate. They know exactly who did it. And again, the dictatorship isn't so total that it encompasses the police. So the police make all the arrests of everyone involved. And Mussolini says, well, I'll get to the bottom of this. There's a lot of bad apples in my organization. We'll clear them out. We'll reform the fascist party. A lot of this is like taken at face value. A lot of it is not, because there's for a time the very strong possibility that he is going to be forced out of power by popular revulsion. But it doesn't happen. The king doesn't want him out. The opposition parties want to observe the formalities. They don't make any move to try to overthrow him. In fact, they leave the parliament, which gives the parliament entirely over to the fascists.
Now,
by the end of the year, he's as strong as he ever was. I think it's in 1925 that he formally basically abolishes representative government.
Now, what is the opinion of these two figures, Hitler and Mussolini, respectively? Because I know they're very different, and Mussolini's advanced farther earlier. But what's the opinion of them say? What would someone like Coolidge know about these guys? What would be the opinion, say, in New York, or the opinion
Very
in
good
Kansas?
question. It's a different time, and what we know or care about foreign affairs isn't that much. right? There's no airplanes that are going to reach us in a few hours. There's no satellites. We know what we know because of, cables from newspaper reports. I can see this vividly in newspaper stories because I'd like to see a photo of what's going on. But if it's overseas, you're not going to see a photo for another 10 days when the ship takes a photo over, so you can see what happened.
Is that how well, that's an interesting point, though. Is that how the newspapers did it? So you would have the story from the cable, because I guess we had one cable to London. Maybe there were others at this.
I think there were a lot of cable. Yeah, you could get news around the world in an instant, the speed of sound, but you wouldn't see the images necessarily.
And then the images would actually come 10 days later and just be like, would they say something like, and here's an image of that story that we told you about?
Yeah, I think there's certainly the general impression is Mussolini's a bad dude because they know that his party is murdering people, but it's not considered anything like a national security threat, right? Because what's Italy at the time? It's a middling power in Europe.
True.
And there's just an interest. A lot of people don't even really know what fascist means. They think it means, well, I'm strong and I'm patriotic. So there's a very weird account from the summer of 1924, where it's announced that the American Fascist Party has been formed, and it is strongly in favor of Coolidge.
Good Lord.
I don't know how Coolidge, if he knew or reacted to this, I don't think he probably would have cared, but I don't think you get a sense it's not like carries all the baggage of, Hitler's anti-Semitism at the time, or of world struggling violence and purifying the blood. But it's sort of seen as, it's also in these accounts, it's always called fascisti. You never see the word fascist. They always just use the Italian word because it's such a new term that's come into the vocabulary.
Interesting times, 1924, 100 years ago. Okay, great. So we've had on John Blackwell from 100 Years Ago News on Twitter. All the foibles of Twitter, it's still a lot of folks on there. 100 Years Ago News. Sign up for his Twitter. I highly recommend it. You'll see me once in a while retweeting things. I'm at myhist, MYHIST. Join us all. Let's stay in communication with everyone. And John, great having you on the program once again.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, history fans. If you enjoy shows like My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, then you'll love Airwave History Plus, now available on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to ad-free listening to My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, plus bonus content and early episodes from dozens of the most popular history shows, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, The American Miracle, Plodding Through the Presidents, American Revolution Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for My History Can Beat Up Your Politics and hit subscribe, or search Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers.